They said he was too big to be gentle, too strong to be kind. In the dusty streets of Deadwood, folks only knew him as the Giant Cowboy. A man feared by outlaws, respected by lawmen, and avoided by most. There were whispers in the saloons about how many men he'd knocked cold with a single punch, how many bounties he'd brought in alive when no one else dared to try. His name was Eli Boone, and to most, he was as untouchable as the mountains. But on one quiet afternoon, when the wind carried the scent of rain and the dust settled just enough to see clearly, everything they thought they knew about him began to change. Eli Boone stood 6'7" without his boots, and when he wore them, which was always, he seemed to tower over the world. His shoulders were broad enough to block a doorway, his hands big enough to wrap clean around a man's head. The lines on his face weren't just from age but from years under the burning sun, squinting across open plains and desert horizons. He wore a black Stetson pulled low over his brow, a long, dusty duster coat that swayed just above his spurred boots, and a belt that carried a Colt .45 he kept so clean you could see your reflection in the barrel. Deadwood was a place where people knew how to mind their own business, but that day, even the most hardened regulars couldn't help but notice the stranger riding into town. She wasn't just another traveler. Her dress, once a deep blue, was faded and dusty from the road. Her hair, tied back hastily, was windblown and tangled. But what caught everyone's eye wasn't her weary look or her empty saddle bags, it was the small bundle in her arms, wrapped in a thin, fraying blanket. The horse she rode was tired, its head low, hooves clopping slow against the wooden planks that made up the main street. She pulled up in front of the saloon, though not for a drink. She had the look of someone who had run out of places to go. Her eyes scanned the street as though hoping to see a familiar face, but there was none. Folks standing outside the general store paused mid-conversation to watch. A couple of cowhands leaned against a hitching post, whispering. Everyone knew the story. Her husband had died just a month before, crushed in a mining collapse. Since then, she'd been drifting, trying to find work, trying to feed herself and her child. Inside the saloon, the air was heavy with the smell of whiskey, cigar smoke, and old wood. Eli Boone sat at a table in the far corner, his chair tilted back, one boot resting on the other knee. He was polishing his Colt with slow, deliberate movements, the kind of ritual a man keeps not just for cleanliness but for calm. He didn't notice strangers often, but when the door swung open and she stepped inside, he looked up. The moment he saw her, something in his gaze sharpened. She was holding the baby close, but the child's muffled whimpering broke through the hum of conversation. It was the kind of cry that wasn't loud but carried the ache of hunger, cold, and exhaustion. The widow looked around the room, perhaps hoping someone might offer a seat, maybe a bit of food. Instead, most eyes turned away. Eli set the Colt down on the table and stood. The sound of his boots on the wooden floor was heavy, each step echoing in the sudden silence. Men who had been leaning back in their chairs straightened. One man even set down his drink, as though ready to step in if trouble started. He walked right up to her and stopped just a few feet away. She looked up at him, and for a moment, her face showed a flicker of fear. He was enormous, and the shadow he cast seemed to swallow her whole. Without a word, he extended his arms. The room seemed to hold its breath. She hesitated, glancing from his weathered face to his hands, hands big enough to crush a bottle with a single squeeze. But something in his eyes stopped her. It wasn't softness exactly, but there was a steadiness there, a quiet strength that felt different from the kind people feared. Slowly, carefully, she placed the baby into his arms. The moment the child touched his chest, the crying stopped. Eli held the baby as though it was made of glass, one massive hand supporting the small head, the other cradling the tiny body against the beat of his heart. He leaned back slightly, shifting the baby to a comfortable position. The saloon was silent except for the faint creak of floorboards as people leaned in to see. The widow let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. She moved to a table and sat down, her shoulders sagging from more than just physical weight. She had been holding herself together for days, maybe weeks, and now, for the first time, she didn't have to. Eli didn't say much, he didn't need to. He just stayed there, rocking ever so slightly, letting the baby's small breaths sink with his own. Hours passed. The widow drifted into sleep at the table, her head resting on her folded arms. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and carrying the smell of rain. Inside, the most feared man in Deadwood sat unmoving, watching over a life so small it barely filled his hands. Some of the patrons left quietly, unwilling to disturb the scene. Others stayed, nursing their drinks slowly, as though they were witnessing something they didn't want to end. Every so often, Eli would glance toward the sleeping mother, his eyes softening in a way that no one had ever seen before. By the time the sun began to sink, casting long amber shadows across the saloon floor, word had already spread. People outside paused to look in through the windows. They weren't seeing the man who had knocked down outlaws with a single punch or tracked fugitives across the desert for weeks. They were seeing something far rarer, the giant cowboy holding a child like it was the most precious thing in the world. When the widow woke, she found her baby still sleeping soundly against Eli's chest. She tried to speak, to thank him, but he just shook his head. "Get yourself something to eat," he said quietly, his voice low and steady. "I'll keep watch." And so she did. She ate for the first time that day, slow and deliberate, as though afraid it might be taken away. The baby never stirred, even when she finished and returned to take the child back into her arms. When she did, Eli stood, adjusting his coat, his eyes lingering on the small bundle for a moment longer before turning toward the door. That day, Eli Boone's legend grew, but not because of the men he'd beaten or the bounties he'd collected. It grew because of the peace he had given to a tired mother and her child. Folks would remember it for years, telling the story in hushed tones around campfires and in quiet corners of saloons. They'd speak of how the giant cowboy, the man they all feared, had sat for hours with a sleeping baby against his heart. Some stories in the West are about blood and bullets, about who drew first and who fell last. But this one was different. This was about the quiet moments, the ones that showed a man's true character. And maybe, just maybe, it was those moments, not the battles, that made a legend. Even years later, when Eli Boone's hair had gone silver and the lines on his face had deepened, people would still mention that day. Sometimes, if you were lucky, you might even see him sitting on a porch somewhere, a faint smile on his lips, watching a child play in the dust. And those who knew the story would nod, remembering that even the biggest, toughest men could have a heart big enough to hold the smallest life in the territory.